So Venus stationed retrograde officially yesterday, and it's stationed at about 21 degrees Gemini. So, as a lot of you probably know, retrograde is actually just an optical illusion, and it basically describes the view of a planet, so the view of Venus from our perspective here on Earth. It appears to be moving backwards in the sky. Um, Venus will retrograde in one particular sign once every 8 years. So this is the last time we had Venus retrograding in Gemini would have been 8 years ago. And Venus, so generally when a planet is retrograde, it's going to deepen our understanding of the themes around that particular sign and the themes around what that planet happens to rule over in our consciousness and archetypes. And Venus is a really interesting planet because it's very much about our experience of each other, our relationships. It describes how we experience affection and love. So it's very much there's sort of a primal essence to Venus in our experience and in our consciousness. Lindsley, you've got Venus, a Gemini stellium. Yeah, so anyone who has strong Gemini in their chart, whether it's Gemini rising, Gemini moon, Gemini sun, or a collection of planets in Gemini, are probably going to be feeling this retrograde in a more pronounced way. And even, I would say, even air signs in general. Now, air signs, because Gemini is an air sign and Venus is going to move in a trine aspect to your air, this retrograde could feel like, in my case, you may not be as motivated as you have been. Because trine is a very flow aspect. It doesn't give you anything to sort of motivate against, and so it could be a little bit harder to get going. The other signs that are going to notice this are ones that are in square alignment to Gemini or air, and that's going to be Sagittarius, Virgo, and Pisces. Venus retrograde will square all of your signs. And so that could create some friction. The square aspect is usually a challenge or a confrontation or a decision or some action has to be taken. So if you're in any of those signs, any moon, sun rising in the what are called the mutable signs, Sag, Pisces, Virgo, and Gemini, then this Venus retrograde could feel a little bit like there's more conflict than you would like, things that you have to work out. But I want to talk a little bit about the deepening aspect that Venus retrograde can bring to our idea of relationship. And I keep going to how it's reflected in the culture, and what I'm noticing is just this concept of the quarantine reaching a new phase for a lot of us. And so Venus in Gemini is very much about our relationship to our immediate environment. Gemini and the third house in the chart are linked. So it's about how we socialize. And because Gemini is such an airy intellectual sign, we're considering and thinking much more deliberately because of that retrograde. The retrograde deepens the experience in some way. We're really thinking more conscientiously about how we socialize. So that's definitely reflected in the certain things being lifted in quarantine and other things not, having to be more careful about how we reach out to one another. And the other thing I think this has to do with is navigating the needs. Okay, so Venus is also really expresses how we manage our affection for each other, and needs come into that. One of the things about Venus is it's considered a personal planet, and personal planets in astrology are those that are closer to um, Earth. And so they have more of an impact on our personal experience of our lives here. Venus is how we've experienced affection in early childhood. It can be how we've integrated the idea of self love or the lack of self love. Like, for example, if you see a connection in a natal chart where Venus is connected to Saturn, for example, then there can be issues around, you know, attracting love or being able to receive love. So when Venus retrogrades in the sky, then we're all kind of reconsidering how we receive, give and receive love. And so if this Venus retrograde is impacting you in a significant way, one of those ways could be becoming very observant. Gemini is all about observing, taking some distance from the emotion, and getting a little perspective on how do I give and receive love in a time of quarantine? How do I show that I care? How do I take care of myself while also being able to be present for my community? You know, and I think that's a real challenge during this retrograde period is how do we show our connection? That's a Venus word and it's a Gemini word. How do we show our connection to each other when we have to wear masks, when we have to social distance, when we have to protect ourselves first before we even go into the community? So, I mean, I think these are some of the themes that we could see coming up during this May 13th, which is today. I mean, it technically retrograded, so it technically stopped in the sky very early this morning, Central Time, and very late last night, Pacific Time. So Central and Eastern folks, this is happening super early today. Folks on the West Coast, this would have happened overnight. But we're all waking up to it. And it takes place all the way through June 25th. So this is not something that we're going to just process really quickly and then move on. This is something that we're going to kind of unpack in phases. The other thing that's happening with this Venus retrograde is that it is going to be squaring Neptune. Now, a square aspect in astrology creates a challenge, creates a conflict, creates a call to action. Venus squaring Neptune can have a couple of different manifestations. One is confusion. Neptune tends to fog up the areas of life that it touches, and when it's fogging up our relationships, when it's fogging up the way we interact socially, as Venus and Gemini are, hey Joan, as Venus and Gemini square Neptune can do, that creates a lot of confusion, and we're seeing that reflected in the headlines. You know, we aren't really sure what the boundaries are. We aren't really sure whether we should go to the grocery store, just wear a mask, or just order in. We aren't really sure how safe things are to interact, and yet we're very hungry to interact as well. I think that Venus retrograde in Gemini it's just bringing it to the surface how important our connections to our community are. And it's that the heart grows, or what is it? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think that's something that's happening too with the Venus retrograde now. So the other aspect is Venus square Neptune, but it can give us a sort of poignancy. You know, that Venus square Neptune can create a sense of sentimentality or nostalgia or melancholy even. You know, I think that we're at the stage of this this, you know, quarantine, where we're noticing the things that we really miss and long for. and we have more appreciation. You know, I think that's one thing we could look to Venus retrograde for. That's a positive. Is really being able to appreciate um, some of the aspects of socializing, of connection, of you know, even self care. I mean, I read something the other night. I think last night I was reading another astrologer, Chani Nicholas, and she had mentioned how this quarantine is really forcing us to look at parts of ourselves that we haven't had time to consider. And they're parts of ourselves that may never have been given consideration um, unless we had something super extreme like a quarantine happen. And so when we're looking at Venus and the themes that Venus rules in our psyche, you know, these are very much about how do I give and take love? How do I give and receive love? How do I um, experience self love? Um, you know, what has my experience of self care been? And what does that even look like? I mean, I can speak from experience that it's forced me to look at some things just because of interactions in my own family. You know, we're all kind of on lockdown, and if you're with a partner or you're with your family, then you know, the boundaries between you and the folks in your environment are very porous right now, and you are probably projecting onto the people in your family issues that you haven't been able to get to in your own self discovery or your own psychological work. So it is actually a very rich time. I don't want to, it's not super fun to do, but it can be a very rich time of self discovery if you can channel that retrograde energy in the healthiest way. And it depends on your chart. So if you have a very strong Venus energy in your natal chart, then the Venus retrograde is going to hit you in a very, I mean, it is for each person going to hit in a very specific way. But if I'm just speaking generally about Venus and Gemini retrograde, then it really speaks to our intellectual connection to ourselves and our own idea of love and self care, to our intellectual connection to our communities and really understanding and bearing witness to what each of us is going through. Um, and that can take a number of different forms. You know, that can just be using technology, as we all are forced to do now, to feel connected and really um, leaning into that technology in a for a deeper purpose beyond just getting the job done, beyond just keeping your business afloat, but really because this is the only way we can feel that deeper connection to each other now is through technology. Gemini is very, very tech savvy, and and yet Gemini, and at the same time, Gemini needs constant stimulation, constant connection, constant information. So you could definitely see this time, you know, becoming a real moment of, um, I don't want to say frantic trying to connect, but there is a bit of scattered energy where this Venus is concerned. And I think it's because this Venus retrograde, we just don't really know what's coming next. And so this can create a lot of anxiety. That was the other piece of Venus retrograde square Neptune in Pisces is anxiety. And so if you start to feel yourself kind of unraveling, a part of you coming apart because you don't have a solid connection, which is Venus, and it's Gemini, to ground you, that's when it's important to really use technology to stay connected, to really reach out, um, and have what you're going through reflected in another person. Because I think it's easy to spin out with Venus square Neptune. I mean, and that's especially true right now. I'm just going to find get my little graph here that can give us a look at kind of some of the dates to watch as we move through this this period, this 6 week period. Um, so yeah, so the Venus square Neptune is really something we're dealing with right now, this week and probably next week. And as Venus, you know, starts to dip back into early degrees of Gemini, um, then it really is in a nice alignment. And this is really more when we get into the later part of June. It starts to trine Saturn. So that to me feels like there are some things that, and maybe this is just we're getting our arms around what quarantine looks like. We're figuring out what the boundaries need to be as we get closer into the end of June and the end of this cycle. So I think what we're going to notice, if we're just speaking about, you know, the global sort of effects of Venus retrograde in Gemini, is that we're in this little bit of a wobbly period where some states are opening all of their businesses and some are still in lockdown, where there's confusion about what's safe and what's not, where there's a longing, there's a need to be connected, and yet there's this confusion about what that even looks like. And so, you know, if we can kind of float through this period of really the next couple weeks, I mean, it could be as well. I don't know. We have this May 22nd. We have a new moon in Gemini where this Venus retrograde is going to be involved, obviously, because it's in the same sign, and that could give us a little bit of a handle on some of these problems and some of this confusion. We could start to, because this new moon is going to trine Saturn, I guess in some ways we could, by the end of May, we could start to see some of the boundaries being more clear, some of the structures that need to be put in place so that we can have a firmer understanding of how to interact with each other. I mean, that's really a big theme about this Venus retrograde, is how do we come together in a safe way, in a way that's supportive to one another. And it's very local, this retrograde. It's very much about, you know, connecting to each other locally in a way that feels supportive, in a way that helps lift up the people nearest us, the people in our immediate surroundings. So I think that's kind of how I see a lot of this retrograde. You know, the other big theme I would mention around Venus retrograde, if we're just talking like personally and culturally, Venus is all about pleasure. It's all about the things that make us feel good. And I definitely think that one of the aspects of this Venus square Neptune that we could see, and I think we're already seeing, is people rushing out to feel numb, to numb all of the anxiety, because it's just too overwhelming. And so that's something that you want to be mindful of is, you know, you may feel drawn to numb the overwhelm by overspending, overindulging, you know, in whatever vice you have, whether it's overeating, overdrinking. But that could be tempting this week and next, especially as that square perfects. And then I think that by the time we get to that new moon on May 22nd, and I'm just thinking about what other aspects that new moon is going to be making with planets. We also are going to be having Mercury. So I think Mercury is in Gemini. Mercury is in Gemini as well. So by that May 22nd date, we could start to see some clarity around, you know, what these boundaries need to look like and how we need to, I keep thinking like structure our perspective get a better grip on reality. Maybe, step back and look at the bigger picture about, how are we going to do our day-to-day life now in this new normal, and what realistically we can expect. I think it's possible that a lot of folks are still under the impression that we are going to go back to a normal that we used to have. And I think that what's going to start to become clear in the next month or two is that that's not going to be possible. There may be attempts during, this period now where we're all opening things up, and we kind of see that that's not going to work. And that's where the retrograde comes in. The Venus retrograde is going to show us what is and is not possible socially right now. The Venus retrograde can give us perspective on how our relationships are forever changed. And then it can give us, which can be quite disillusioning, and then it can give us a way to, once this Venus retrograde moves in direct motion, June 25th and beyond, and that's really July we're looking at, now we have a better, clearer understanding of what this new normal looks like. Now, I should say that Venus retrograde is really only one thing that's going to be going on in June. And July is a much different sort of place. It feels to me like we are now just ramping up for what's going to be a big turning point in June. And so it's helpful to use this Venus retrograde now to be gentle with how you move forward into your communities. To be thoughtful, that Gemini word, and to very much, give yourself the space to witness with clarity what's going on, to be gentle about the way that you expect society to recover. Be not necessarily gentle or practical, but objective, I think is the word, because that's really what Gemini teaches us, is objectivity. So rather than be in all your feelings, which this last full moon that we had definitely stirred up. So we had a full moon in Scorpio May 7th. And then just a few days later, we have this stationing. There is a lot of inner turbulence that's just been stirred up in all of us. And the Venus retrograde is saying, okay, it's really time to get perspective. We just can't live in that turbulence for very long. We have to find a way intellectually to process these changes. And that may mean taking a step back. That may mean being, I want to say quiet, but it's not so much quiet as just that groping around in the dark and searching for clarity, searching for the truth, the real truth. And that's going to be elusive in the short term, unfortunately. And I point directly to that retrograde in Venus square Neptune. That makes me want to get the dates of this square very, very clear. So does anybody have any questions on any of it? Yeah, surrender. Victoria, that's a good word. It is very much surrender. And I think that Scorpio moon did, bring up that notion of surrender as well. I think there was a lot more pain involved with the Scorpio moon. It can feel dark. We're certainly dealing with a lot of grim news right now. And even a sense of helplessness. Yes, hard not to know what to do exactly. So Lindsley's asking, you mentioned July moving forward. Well, in July, I mean, here's the thing. We kind of go through June and we have all these heavy, heavy transits. Not only do we have Mercury retrograde through most of, I'm sorry, we have Venus retrograde in Gemini until the end of June. And even then, it's still going to be in its shadow phase. So Venus is not going to be super strong. But we have Mercury retrograde June 1st through the 18th, Mercury retrograde's June 18th through July 11th, but it's in its shadow from June 1st until the end of July. So June and July, two of the personal planets that we count on for our own sense of control, for our own sense of clarity and a sense of well-being, those planets are going retrograde in our charts, in our minds, in the sky, in our sense of reality, which says to me that it's very hard to get clear about what the hell's going on. And there's a lot of, on top of that, we'll have Jupiter conjunct Pluto again, which is the aspect that was in place when we first saw the spike in COVID-19 cases. So that happens the last week of June and the first week of July. And then we have eclipses. I mean, it's so much stuff. So surrender becomes incredibly important, and moving forward in July is going to look a little bit like crawling out from, I hate to say the word wreckage because that sounds so scary, but it is crawling out from under the weight of all of this unknown. And it could also look like learning the hard way, what this new reality looks like. I do think that the closer we get to that time period of late June, and the more that I see the way that the culture is going, it feels like we're going to see a spike in June. It may not be reported until later. The spike may be something we only know in hindsight. In the same way that we're finding out that far more people were infected than we knew because the testing was behind. I suspect that's what we're going to find out when we look at the records in and maybe we're getting that clarity in August, because August is the next time frame where we have the least amount of retrogrades and a little bit of space from all the eclipses. So, what does that mean? What do we do with that information? So Victoria's saying that this reminds her of the end of a zombie movie where all the disheveled people walk out. Yeah, it kind of feels like that. It kind of feels like that, and there's still more to unpack in the fall. So it is a little bit like, let's pace ourselves. Let's not unpack too much too soon, because our consciousness can really only process things moment by moment right now. And I think what the retrograde in Venus is telling us this week, and then if I move that retrograde forward, I just want to see how long this square to Venus is in play. All right, so it is really into May 25th. So we have that Venus retrograde square Neptune from now all the way to May 25th, which is a good long time. And it's a good long time of not having a lot of clarity. So let's see, Lindsley's saying, literally have tickets to events with family but haven't canceled yet, but feeling like summer still isn't safe to go out. So this is the question, I think, Lindsley, that we're going to be dealing with. Where are the boundaries? How far can we go beyond the boundaries? What are our limits? And again, I think that won't be as clear to us until we get to June. I'm just saying, I'm gonna just move this chart forward so I have a reference point. But when The Venus retrogrades trine Saturn. This is a ways off. Yeah, it's really the end of June where we get super clear. You know, in the next few weeks, if we're just looking at, hi Doris, if we're just looking at May, you know, the biggest theme that I'm looking at is Venus square Neptune, but then also Mercury and Gemini moving through this this configuration. So not only is Venus going to be square Neptune, Mercury is going to be square Neptune as well, right around that new moon in Gemini, which is next week. I can't believe it's next week. Is that right? It's 10 days away. We have a new moon in Gemini. So we're, you know, if we're just looking at the next 10 days, it's going to be really hard to know what our boundaries are, what social distancing, what the boundaries of social distancing are. Is it, do I stay in my home and just order in? Or is it okay for me to go to the park but keep distance? Or can I have that friend over who's also been 100% quarantined? Or should I just not? You know, it's going to be those kind of decisions that we just are going to have to like really center in our hearts, because there is not going to be clear direction on the outside what to do, I would say, until we get to the end of June. That's a long time away. It feels like a long time away. You know, so this is really where the, you know, where the quarantine gets to a place of, I mean, in a lot of ways, you could say there's a depth available to us now because we're really going to have to tune into our heart center. Venus is all about the head. So the challenge is going to be, what does our heart say? Neptune and Pisces, you know, that's very much a divine connection. Venus and Gemini square Neptune and Pisces is all about, how do I marry the intellect and with what my heart says, with what my connection to divine guidance says? How do I bring those together in a way that can bring me peace, in a way that can bring me clarity? That's the challenge we face during the next 6 weeks. That's a big part of it. That's the question you can be asking yourself. And I think the other interesting thing about Gemini, we have this, and we are moving towards a stellium in Gemini around that new moon. We'll have the new moon at 2 degrees Gemini. We'll have Venus and Mercury exactly conjunct at 20 degrees Gemini. And we have the North Node in Gemini. So it's really about, what are the questions, asking the right questions. And because of its connection to Neptune, and then, I mean, it also makes a square to Mars at that point. What are the right questions to ask? Where do I need to surrender control? And where do I need to take action? I mean, those are all those archetypes put together when you say Mars, Neptune, and Gemini. It's going to be really about being your own investigator and really gathering the right information so that you can make the right choices for you. And I do think that it becomes this real moment of finding grace in the contemplation of these questions. I don't know if that makes sense. And, you know, the other thing I want to say about that new moon, which is still, again, 10 days away or so. Actually, is it 10? Yeah, it's about 12 days away. Is in that intellectual contemplation, in that ability to get perspective, to step outside of the emotion of the moment that was stirred up around the May 7th Scorpio moon, step outside the emotion and the drama and the grief and the loss, to get some perspective and use your wits about you to, you know, seek out information from the right sources, the sources that feel aligned for you, and then make your own decision based on that. That's really, if I had to pull all this together, you will be able to come to that place. You know, by the end of this month, you'll have a sense of some of the boundaries that work for you in your specific community, because there isn't going to be this sort of overarching truth, this overarching clarity. It's going to be up to you individually. Even when we're talking about block to block neighborhoods, it's really like what feels right, what feels aligned, what do I know from my research feels right. And then that gives you this opportunity to sort of carve a path. And really it's going to be a short-term path. You know, I think it's just too difficult this year to look beyond even a month as to what things are going to look like, you know, and in terms of like tickets that you have for events, you know, trips that you booked. I really think what's going to happen is it's going to have to be case by case basis, and it's going to depend on how your community comes together. If your community is not working together between now and the end of July, the cost of that is going to be felt moving into the fall. You know, I do think we're going to see that the communities that are coming together now are going to be the ones most resilient at the end of the year. The ones that are very fractured are the ones that are going to pay the steeper price when we get to the end of the year. And that's really just speaking to Saturn and Aquarius. Saturn is in Aquarius until July 1st. And then it backs up into Capricorn. And when it does that, it's almost like, you know, that would be a time when we really pay the price of whatever it is we've ignored over the last 2 years that Saturn has been in Capricorn. It's a real reckoning, a moment of reckoning, because it's backing up into a sign that it won't be in again for another 29 years. So it really closes this big chapter. That's right around July. And so that's kind of why I'm feeling like we have this this opportunity now to gather our wits about us. That's how I think about Gemini, is that witty sign. It's very intellectual. It's very heady. You know, do your research. Listen to each other. Listen to the most reliable sources. And then check in with your higher guidance. And that's that Neptune and Pisces. Check in with that Neptune and Pisces, whatever your connection to God, Goddess, all that is. And listen. So it is kind of a moment of it's a pause. It's a pause for clarity, a pause for perspective, a pause for guidance. Hey Leona, does anyone have any questions on any of that? Thank you for those of you who are joining I don't recognize. I'm just talking about Venus in retrograde and how it's making this long square to Neptune between now and really the end of May, and kind of what those themes come up as a consequence. And you know, the other big aspect we have coming up is this May 22nd new moon that's in a really beautiful alignment with Saturn retrograde in Aquarius. So, you know, there's a lot of unpacking that we have to do. And I think some of this is the consequences of the last how long has it been? I think I'm on 62nd day of quarantine here. The consequences of, I'm glad that's helpful, Victoria. The consequences of all of the last few months are going to start to become more evident, you know, and that's Saturn retrograde. Saturn is about the consequences. It's the cause and effect. So we do start to see the wearing of this time in quarantine, what it has done. Have we gone back into some bad habits? Are we, are our coping techniques turning into, you know, toxic behaviors, or are they deepening our relationship with ourselves? Um, so yeah, we really are coming into this deeper. It's a good time to go back into therapy for those of you who are familiar with that process, to just sort of unpack kind of where you are now and take inventory of the last couple months. Yeah, since quarantine started, since Saturn moved into Aquarius, take an inventory of what has changed in your life, and how that affects all the pieces, and what's going to have to change moving forward consequently. So yeah, I mean, I think that's about all I have to say on all of that. I don't want to get too far ahead of the game, because I do think it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the change. So it's good to just use today, especially today and really the next week. Venus is going to be at a virtual standstill until we get to that new moon on the 22nd. Venus is just going to be at 21 degrees, only moving about 1 degree. And so, you can use this time to do research, to pick up something that you wanted to learn that you had to cast off for whatever reason, to dig in to gaining perspective on the way that you give and receive love. Any questions on any of that? So I think I'm going to cut this short today. I'm not going to do a whole hour. So if you're interested in one-on-ones, please let me know. My schedule's gotten more manageable just because I've been making it that way, and I've had more time to really, work one-on-one. And also any feedback on any subjects that you would like me to see talk about more in some of these videos, because I'm sort of looking ahead and trying to think of what people really want to learn more about this year. Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining. And Victoria, thank you for getting me going. I was well, I just won't do one today. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Crystal. And this should be up on my live for the next, I think they hang up there for about another day. And I'll post this on YouTube also. So take care, everybody.